The end of World War II did not bring with it a singular moment of peace, but rather a slow, deliberate transition into a new world of uncertainty. For Britain, the defeat of Nazi Germany marked the conclusion of a war that had ravaged both its people and its resources. One of the most critical aspects of Britain's wartime preparedness was its emergency fuel reserves, vast stocks of petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel that had been carefully accumulated over years of wartime planning. These reserves were never intended for long-term use. They had been created with one purpose in mind: to sustain Britain's ability to continue fighting. But now, with victory secured, these reserves had no further purpose. Their fate would become a symbol of the profound challenges Britain faced in transitioning from a war economy to a peacetime one. In the immediate aftermath of victory in May 1945, the scale of Britain's surplus fuel reserves was staggering. By some estimates, the country had stockpiled over 300 million gallons of oil. These reserves had been strategically stored in underground tanks, warehouses, and facilities across the country, designed to be rapidly accessed in the event of a national emergency. They were a vital part of the British war effort, ensuring that the military could continue its operations despite the constant threat of fuel shortages. Yet, with the cessation of hostilities, these supplies now represented a significant burden. Not only was there no longer a pressing need for such vast quantities of fuel, but the costs of maintaining these reserves, both in terms of storage and upkeep, were mounting. The British government, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, had initially planned for the wartime economy to shift quickly back into a more sustainable peacetime model. This transition, however, was far more difficult than anticipated. The war had left the country's infrastructure in tatters, and the economy was in a dire state. Food shortages, inflation, and an overwhelming national debt made any attempt at quick economic recovery seem distant. With this grim economic reality in mind, the emergency fuel reserves, once a symbol of Britain's wartime preparedness, became an albatross. The problem was not merely the excess of fuel, but the complex nature of its disposal. The reserves were held in multiple locations, some of which were in remote and inaccessible areas. The British government faced two primary options: attempt to sell or repurpose the fuel, or, more pragmatically, destroy the surplus. The first option, selling the fuel, was fraught with complications. The global fuel market had been severely disrupted by the war, and nations were hesitant to purchase what was perceived as surplus stock. Furthermore, Britain's economy was too fragile to absorb the potential financial return from such a sale. The second option, destruction, was equally complicated. Destroying millions of gallons of fuel seemed wasteful, but there was no feasible way to transport and store it indefinitely. The government explored the possibility of using the reserves for civilian needs, such as fueling transportation and industrial sectors, but the scale of the reserves was overwhelming. Even with the most ambitious plans, Britain's domestic infrastructure was far from equipped to handle such a vast quantity of fuel without significant investment in new storage and distribution facilities. In the face of these challenges, the government's response was initially slow and indecisive. Several governmental bodies were involved in the process, but there was no clear central authority overseeing the fuel reserves. The Ministry of Fuel and Power, tasked with managing the country's energy resources, struggled to come to terms with the surplus. The fuel was neither easy to transport nor easy to use, and a lack of coordination between various departments only exacerbated the situation. The uncertainty of the post-war world left Britain unsure of how best to balance its immediate needs with long-term recovery. Despite these hurdles, the government's first major action came in 1946, when it was decided that the fuel would begin to be used up, rather than simply destroyed. In theory, this would alleviate the strain on the country's finances, as well as gradually reduce the storage burden. The government began to release fuel to various sectors, prioritizing essential industries like transportation and agriculture. But the logistics of distribution proved problematic. Fuel shortages persisted in some areas, while in others, the surplus remained stagnant. Fuel was allocated according to local need, but it became clear that the sheer volume of reserves was too great to manage effectively. The economy simply couldn't absorb the fuel quickly enough. As the years progressed, Britain's government began to consider more drastic measures. In 1947, a report by the National Economic Council suggested the possibility of large-scale destruction of the surplus fuel. This was seen as the most cost-effective solution, despite the loss involved. The cost of maintaining and securing the fuel was proving increasingly burdensome, and the country's financial situation made the disposal of such an asset seem unavoidable. Destruction was not immediate, but the groundwork was laid for it to happen. One of the key factors in the decision to destroy large quantities of fuel was the evolving nature of Britain's energy strategy. The country's focus was shifting toward rebuilding its industrial base, securing its future energy supply, and transitioning away from the wartime economy. In this new environment, the fuel reserves no longer fit within Britain's long-term plans. The priority became securing energy for industry and public needs, rather than maintaining a vast stockpile of wartime surplus. By 1949, the government had made the decision to scale back the reserves significantly. Some fuel was sold off to countries in Europe, still recovering from the war, but much of it was destroyed in controlled burn-offs. The most infamous of these took place at depots in rural England, where vast quantities of fuel were ignited in a series of highly publicized events. The sheer scale of the destruction was staggering. Millions of gallons of fuel went up in smoke, a visual representation of both the wastefulness of war and the growing need for Britain to look forward, not backward. However, this destruction was not without its critics. Many Britons, still reeling from the war's devastation, saw the burning of fuel as a waste of precious resources that could have been used to rebuild their country. Yet, the pragmatic decision to eliminate the reserves was made with an eye on economic stability. In the face of Britain's ongoing financial difficulties, the government had few other options. The cost of maintaining these reserves, especially as Britain struggled to pay off its war debt, was deemed unsustainable. By the early 1950s, the majority of Britain's emergency fuel reserves had been disposed of, either used up in the post-war recovery process or destroyed outright. What remained was a much smaller stockpile, one that was easier to manage and that reflected the country's changing priorities. The end of the fuel reserves, however, was more than just the disposal of material resources. It was a marker of the end of an era defined by wartime necessity and the overwhelming need for self-sufficiency. With the war now firmly in the past, Britain could begin to move forward, slowly recovering from the scars of global conflict. Yet, the consequences of that final destruction were far from over. By eliminating this immense wartime resource, Britain made a calculated but irreversible decision. The immediate impact may have seemed small, just one part of the larger post-war recovery effort, but the legacy of that fuel, its disposal, and the choices made in its wake would linger for years to come. In the years following the disposal of Britain's emergency fuel reserves, the full consequences of this decision slowly became clear. What initially seemed like a straightforward move, eliminating a wartime surplus, unfolded into a story that highlighted the complexities of Britain's post-war recovery and the economic forces that shaped the nation's future. The immediate aftermath of the fuel reserves destruction did not result in a noticeable fuel crisis, but it did leave a lasting imprint on the country's energy policies and economic strategies. By the early 1950s, with most of the surplus fuel gone, Britain began to shift its focus to rebuilding its industrial base and addressing the energy needs of its growing post-war population. The destruction of the emergency reserves, while necessary in the eyes of the government, proved to be a sharp reminder of how limited the country's resources had become. With the wartime era officially over, Britain had to adjust to a world that no longer revolved around the urgency of global conflict. In the immediate term, the disappearance of the surplus fuel provided some temporary relief to the government's finances. The large costs associated with storing, maintaining, and guarding the fuel were no longer a burden. However, this was a short-term gain. As Britain embarked on its rebuilding process, it became increasingly clear that fuel, specifically oil, was a cornerstone of this effort. The destruction of its emergency fuel reserves meant that the country had less strategic flexibility in times of need. Unlike the wartime era, when vast stockpiles could be mobilized for military and industrial purposes, post-war Britain lacked a reliable and secure fuel buffer. The government's decisions in this regard would shape its energy policies for decades. the rise of petroleum and the global energy market soon posed another challenge. While Britain had been largely self-sufficient during the war, the post-war world was increasingly interconnected. The supply and demand for oil had become a complex web of international agreements, and Britain's energy needs would now depend on the global oil market rather than self-sufficiency. The destruction of emergency fuel reserves meant that Britain had to increasingly rely on imports, which exposed the country to the volatile nature of the international market. During the 1950s and 1960s, as the United Kingdom's economy stabilized, the need for oil became even more pronounced. The fuel was needed for transportation, both civilian and industrial, and to power the machinery essential for rebuilding factories and infrastructure. However, as the years progressed, oil shortages began to emerge. Although the British government had shifted its focus to importing fuel from sources like the Middle East, the dependency on foreign suppliers raised concerns. By the late 1950s, the global oil market was starting to show signs of strain as demand for oil surged across the world. The British government was left vulnerable to the fluctuations of supply and demand. In this new environment, the importance of Britain's post-war energy strategy became ever clearer. The country's reliance on imported oil, without any significant reserves to buffer it from supply disruptions, placed it at the mercy of global economic conditions. This vulnerability was starkly exposed during the Suez Crisis of 1956. Although the fuel reserves had been long disposed of by that point, the disruption of global oil shipments during the crisis further underscored the dangers of relying on foreign sources for energy. The British were reminded that they could not afford to maintain a position of energy insecurity. Without adequate reserves or the capability to access emergency fuel supplies, the country found itself in a precarious position. In addition to these strategic concerns, the disappearance of the fuel reserves had economic consequences that stretched beyond the energy sector. The destruction of the surplus fuel was a visual manifestation of the British government's broader financial struggles. In the years following the war, Britain found itself grappling with the consequences of war debt, inflation, and the challenges of rebuilding its infrastructure. Every decision made during this time was influenced by a single overriding concern: how to balance the need for immediate recovery with the pressure of long-term debt. The fuel reserves, once seen as an indispensable resource, became a casualty of this delicate balancing act. While Britain continued to rebuild its industrial economy, the international nature of energy markets increasingly drew attention to the fact that the country had made a significant and irreversible decision. Many analysts and policymakers began to question whether the destruction of these reserves was, in hindsight, a wise move. The question remained: could Britain have repurposed the fuel for a future crisis? Could it have created a more sustainable, long-term solution that would have given it more flexibility in the face of international oil shortages? The fuel reserves, now long gone, would not provide an answer to these questions, but they continued to serve as a stark reminder of the country's post-war vulnerability. The economic and strategic implications of the destroyed reserves also played out in the United Kingdom's relationships with other nations. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Britain's position in the global economic order was shifting. While it remained an important player in Europe, its relative global power was diminishing. The post-war years saw the United States and the Soviet Union rise as superpowers, dominating the international stage. As Britain moved away from its imperial past, the need to secure vital resources such as oil became increasingly evident. Without the reserves to act as a buffer, Britain found itself negotiating for fuel and energy access with an increasing number of global players. By the 1970s, as the British government began to focus more on energy security, the events surrounding the destruction of the emergency fuel reserves were revisited. In hindsight, the lack of strategic foresight in their disposal appeared even more pronounced. As the oil crisis of 1973 struck, the British economy was once again thrown into turmoil. Long-term energy security had been a concern for decades, and the absence of a substantial stockpile to buffer such events now seemed like a costly mistake. Yet, in the 1950s and 1960s, the government's decision to dispose of the fuel reserves had appeared rational. The immediate post-war economic situation demanded attention to the most pressing issues: rebuilding the economy, repaying the national debt, and addressing the daily needs of the population. The urgency of creating a peacetime economy, free from the wartime mentality of stockpiling and conserving, was palpable. But as the years wore on, the true cost of that decision began to take shape. It is important to remember that the destruction of Britain's emergency fuel reserves was not a solitary event. It was part of a larger set of decisions made in the context of a war-torn economy struggling to transition to peacetime. In this way, the fate of the reserves was intrinsically linked to the larger economic policies and priorities that defined post-war Britain. In retrospect, the dismantling of the fuel reserves was not merely a loss of material wealth, but a symbol of the deep-rooted challenges the country faced in navigating the complex transition from wartime to peacetime. The fuel reserves, once a symbol of national preparedness, became part of a much larger, often painful process of economic readjustment. Their destruction, while seemingly pragmatic in the short term, would become a lasting reminder of Britain's post-war struggles that would echo through its energy policies, its global position, and its economic decisions for decades to come. Ultimately, the real cost of the reserves' disposal was not just measured in gallons of fuel burned or wasted, but in the opportunities lost to secure the country's future energy needs. As Britain entered the latter half of the 20th century, the lessons learned from the fate of its wartime fuel reserves would be absorbed into its energy strategy. But it was a lesson learned the hard way, at a time when the nation was least prepared to make such a crucial decision.